The first sign was not water. It was color. A dark bruise spreading through a dead white pan of alkali clay, where nothing had grown for as long as Clara Hale had owned the place. 14 old Spanish cattle stood around it in a loose half-circle. Their ribs showed, their horns were too long. Their hides carried every dull shade of dust, smoke, rust, and old blood. And at their feet, the ground was changing, not cracking, not blowing away. Changing. The clay the county had called worthless was turning black beneath the cuts of their hooves. Then one thin bead of water lifted through the mud. Clara dropped to her knees so fast the dry earth tore the skin through her skirt. The cattle did not bellow. They did not panic. They only watched the wet place with the grave patience of animals that had not found a miracle. They had remembered one. A year earlier, every man in the sale barn had laughed when she bought them. Not because they hated her. That would have been easier. They laughed because the mistake looked too obvious to be cruel. The corral's yard sat under a low tin roof at the edge of Las Cruces, full of sweat, flies, and the sour smell of scared stock. Buyers leaned against the rails in good boots and clean hats, waiting for beef they could weigh with their eyes. Big shorthorns, Durhams with deep barrels, soft red cattle bred for feedlots, show rings, and water close enough to smell. Then the last pen opened. 14 horned things shuffled into the dust. They were old Spanish scrub cattle, the kind vaqueros still called Criollo when they were being polite, and desert bones when they were not. They had high hips, sharp shoulders, and horns wide enough to make a gate look narrow. Some were patched with brindle. Some were mouse gray. One pale cow had a face as narrow and watchful as a deer. The auctioneer wiped his neck with a handkerchief and grinned. "Here they are, gentlemen. 14 museum pieces with horns attached. Eat more cactus than hay, if the stories are true. Who wants history on the hoof?" Clara stood at the back in a faded brown dress with a purse so thin she could feel every coin through the cloth. She had 80 acres east of town. 80 acres everyone else had refused. A dead arroyo, a collapsed windmill, a one-room adobe house with a roof that leaked dust instead of rain. And she had $27 left after the deed. The sensible thing was to buy seed, wire, and one gentle milk cow. But she had watched the other cattle all morning. They bawled when separated. They shoved into corners. They licked empty troughs as if water might appear by complaint. These 14 did none of that. They stood with their heads low and their eyes open, reading the ground, the wind, the fence, the people. Not tame, not frightened. Listening. Harlan Pike turned from the front rail and looked at Clara as if he had already guessed the foolish thing she was about to do. Pike owned 300 irrigated acres along the Mesilla ditch and more red cattle than any man needed to count out loud. His hat was pale as cream. His gloves were new. He had the calm of a man whose wells had never lied to him. "Mrs. Hale," he said, loud enough for the nearest buyers, "those aren't cattle. Those are fence problems with legs." A few men chuckled. Clara raised her hand. The auctioneer squinted over the rail. "I have a bid." $2 a head, Clara said. The yard went quiet in the way a room goes quiet when someone drops a lamp. $2 a head was not respect. It was disposal money. Still, nobody raised her. The auctioneer looked around, amused and relieved. "Sold," he said, and struck the block, "to the lady who wants the pass to eat her pasture." That line got the biggest laugh. Clara signed the paper with a hand that did not tremble until the clerk stopped watching. Pike caught her near the loading chute. "Let my hands take them off your property before they die," he said. "I'll give you your money back. No woman alone should have to learn drought arithmetic the hard way." Clara looked past him at the pale-faced cow. The cow looked back, not pleading, not grateful, measuring. "No," Clara said. Pike gave a small smile. Pride is light until a person has to carry it uphill. Clara folded the bill of sale and put it in her purse. Then I had better start walking. The walk to her place took half a day. 14 old cattle followed her down a road that shimmered in the heat. Children ran beside the procession until their mothers called them back. Men in wagon seats shook their heads. One shouted that the boneyard was in the other direction. Clara did not answer. She counted steps instead. She had learned to count after her husband died. Posts remaining, boards missing, pounds of flour, days of water. Money was not the only kind of arithmetic that could starve a person. Her place looked worse with cattle on it. The 80 acres were a wash of hard, pale ground, creosote, mesquite, gray grass, and one dry arroyo that cut the southern end like an old scar. The well behind the house gave a bucket and a half before it coughed sand. The windmill had one broken blade and no pump rod. Half the fence lay down in the dust as if even the posts had lost faith. Clara spent the first month putting the boundary back together. She dug post holes with a bar. She stretched rusty wire until her palms split. She carried water before sunrise and after dark because the sun stole too much in between. And the cattle watched. That was what unsettled her at first. They did not crowd the trough. They did not break through bad fence. They did not stand waiting to be fed. They moved. Slowly, deliberately. One gray steer with a horn, chipped at the tip, nosed through mesquite and stripped the small leaves as neatly as a hand stripping rosemary. A speckled cow, hooked dry, brushed down with her horns so a younger heifer could reach the green inside. The pale-faced cow led them around the open flats and into the thorn when the day turned white. Clara named that cow Saint, not because she was gentle, but because she seemed to expect obedience from the earth. The gray steer became Notch, a red heifer became Ember, a black and white cow with one torn ear became Psalm, because she hummed low in her throat before weather changed. Naming them was not sentiment, it was proof. A thing with a name could not be dismissed as scrap. The town kept dismissing them anyway. Men rode by and asked if she had started collecting horns for coat racks. Women at the store grew soft-voiced around her, the way people speak near a sickbed. Even the blacksmith's wife told her, not unkindly, that loneliness could make a person see sense where there was only hunger. Only one man looked at the herd without amusement. His name was Rafael Soto. He lived up the old arroyo in a low house of sun-baked brick, where he raised beans, chickens, and opinions nobody in town asked for. He had driven cattle before the railroad cut the country into prices. His face was dark and lined, and his hands were shaped by rains, rope, and weather. He came to Clara's fence at sundown with a sack of dried chile, and stood watching the cattle until the light thinned. "They waste no step," he said. Clara leaned on the post she had been setting. "Is that good?" "It is old." He nodded toward Saint, who stood with her nose into the wind. These cattle were made before men thought cattle should be comfortable. They know thorn. They know dry miles. They know what the new red animals forgot. Clara waited. Raphael tapped 2 fingers under his own eyes. "Do not only feed them. Watch where they choose not to go. Watch where they return. Old animals keep maps in their bodies." Then he handed her the chile and walked away. That sentence stayed with her longer than the food. Old animals keep maps in their bodies. So Clara began watching more carefully. She watched where Saint refused to graze, even when grass showed. She watched where Notch scraped mineral crust from stones and where the others took turns licking after him. She learned that the cattle did not eat a pasture down. They skimmed it, left it, and returned when the air changed. They took mesquite beans before they fell. They chewed yucca stalks after Clara split them. They nosed under dry sand in the arroyo and found coolness where her boot found only heat. Every evening, a boy appeared at the road fence. His name was Will Mercer. He was 11, narrow as a fence rail, with a sunburn that never finished healing. His father ran freight between town and the rail spur. His mother took in washing. Will had the restless hunger of a boy who wanted somewhere to belong and had found, of all things, 14 ugly cattle. At first he only watched. Then one afternoon Clara caught him sliding under the wire with a bundle of grass tied in twine. He froze, the cattle did not. Ember came forward and took the grass from his hand with a rough pink tongue. "You shouldn't come through without asking," Clara said. Will swallowed. "Yes, ma'am." "Ask then, may I?" Clara looked at his thin wrists, the grass stains on his shirt, the open adoration on his face. "You can help carry water." He grinned as if she had offered him a horse. From then on, Will came whenever chores released him. He learned the names. He learned which horn to avoid and which cow liked her neck scratched with a stick. He learned to burn spines off prickly pear without wasting the flesh, and how to cut mesquite pods before the pack rats claimed them. One evening, after they had stacked cactus pads beside the shed, he asked the question everyone else asked with laughter. "Why did you buy them?" Clara took a long time answering. Because they were cheap would have been true. Because she was desperate would have been truer. But neither answer reached the center. "Because they looked like they knew how to be poor," she said. Will frowned. "Cattle can be poor. Anything can be poor," Clara said. "The question is whether it knows how to keep living anyway." By July, the first dry spell became a drought. By August, the drought became a county-wide silence. The monsoon clouds built every afternoon over the mountains, high and purple and full of lies. Thunder walked the horizon. Lightning stitched the sky. Then the clouds emptied somewhere else, leaving only heat and dust. The ditch water dropped. The town well fell by inches. The arroyo behind Clara's property turned from sand to powder. Her own well gave less each week. At night she sat at her table with a candle, a pencil, and columns of numbers that had no mercy. 14 cattle, 1 woman, 1 boy when his mother could spare him so many buckets a day, so many cactus pads, so many pounds of mesquite beans, so many days before the well stopped pretending. Drought did not arrive as one disaster. It arrived as subtraction. First the garden, then the hens, then coffee, then laundry, then sleep. Clara learned to hear the well rope in her dreams, learned the difference between a bucket that rose full and one that rose insulting. Still, the cattle held. They thinned, yes, everything thinned. But their eyes stayed bright, their hooves stayed hard. Their hides did not go dead and dusty the way Pike's shorthorns did. Across the road, Harlan Pike's red cattle stood in irrigated fields that were no longer green enough to justify their fences. They waited by hay racks with their mouths open, great soft animals built for a world that kept its promises. Pike rode by less often after that. When he did, he looked longer. One morning he stopped at Clara's gate with 2 men behind him and a paper folded in his gloved hand. "Mrs. Hale," he said, with the voice he used in town meetings, "you cannot carry this land through a dry year. Nobody blames you. Sell now while there is still value in the deed." Clara was repairing a trough with a strip of barrel iron. Value to whom? To a proper operation. She looked up then. Pike's face remained polite, but his eyes moved beyond her, measuring the flat, the arroyo, the boundary, the possibility of addition. "I'll pay you enough to go east," he said. "You can live near people, work in a shop, take in boarders. Anything is better than dying out here for cattle that should have been tallow." Notch, as if offended, tore a strip of mesquite bark behind her. Pike's mouth tightened. "Be reasonable." Clara stood. Her skirt was streaked with dust. Her hands were raw. There was a blister open on her thumb. And she had not eaten meat in 3 weeks. Reason sounded very tempting in that moment. That was the danger of it. It did not always sound like surrender. Sometimes it sounded like rest. "I am not selling," she said. Pike unfolded the paper and folded it again. "Your well will fail. Likely. Your cattle will die. Maybe. You will come to me then." Clara picked up the hammer. "No," she said. "If I come, It will be to ask why your proper operation needed my poor one so badly." For the first time, the politeness left his face. He rode away without another word. That evening, Clara added one more column to her paper. What a person keeps when selling would be easier. She could not put a number under it, so she left the space blank. Winter did not save them. The cold came dry. Wind scraped the flats until even moonlight seemed full of dust. The price of hay climbed like a fever. Men who had mocked Clara sold breeding cows for half what they had paid. Wagon after wagon passed her road, thin animals stumbling toward the rail pens, bells dull around their necks. The laughter disappeared from town. Fear took its place. Fear made voices short. Fear made good men jealous. Fear made neighbors count each other's buckets. Clara saw it in the store when women stood close to the flour sacks and pretended not to look at the water barrel. She saw it in the way children stopped running. She saw it in Mr. Voss, who owned 40 acres north of her and 3 daughters with hollow cheeks. He came to her fence one dusk and stood there watching Saint pull thorn leaves into her mouth. "She still giving milk?" he asked, meaning Psalm. "A little," Clara said. He nodded. His own cow had dried up in October. For a moment he looked as if he might ask something. Then pride shut his mouth. He tipped his hat and walked away. Clara carried a quart of milk to his porch after dark and left it without knocking. The next morning the jar came back clean, with 6 eggs inside. That was how the first bargain began. Not charity, trade. Dignity weighed differently when both hands touched it. More bargains followed. A repaired wheel for a bucket of mesquite beans. A day's fence work for cactus pads. A sack of cornmeal for help hauling water before dawn. Clara did not become generous all at once. She became practical in a wider circle. The arithmetic had changed. Her survival could not be separated from the people watching her survive. By March, Pike's ditch was mud. By April, his deep well began to cough sand. That should have been impossible. People had built decisions around that well. They had loaned him money against it. They had trusted it more than they trusted weather. When it failed, something larger than water broke. Pike's men drove half his herd to market under a sky so blue it looked polished. The animals went slow, heads low, tongues pale. No one joked about Clara's cattle on that road anymore. One trail buyer did stop. He had come up from El Paso with a line of rangy stock and no patience for town gossip. He leaned on Clara's fence and studied the Criollo cattle with eyes that had priced animals in every condition the desert could invent. "Those yours?" "Yes." He pointed at Ember, who was thin but alert, belly round with calf. "She's held better than anything I've seen south of Santa Fe." Clara said nothing. "What do you feed?" "What they find." He laughed once, not unkindly. "Then they find better than most men." He offered $50 for Ember. $50, more than twice what Clara had paid for the whole herd. Will, standing behind her with a water bucket, stopped breathing. Clara felt the number move through her body like cool water. $50 would buy hay, wire, flour, coffee. A doctor, if one became necessary. She looked at Ember. The heifer stood in the shade of a mesquite, chewing, watching the buyer as if he were another weather pattern. "Not property. Not pet-proof." "She's not for sale," Clara said. The buyer looked at her, then at the cow, then back at her. "Smart answer," he said. "Rare one." He left without haggling. That evening, Will asked if she regretted it. Clara poured the last of the well water into the trough. Every smart thing looks foolish to somebody who wants a quick answer. The dry year became a second dry year. By then, the land seemed less like land than a thing waiting to decide who belonged to it. Saint changed first. She stopped leading the herd along the familiar browse routes and began standing at the western fence before dawn. Her nose lifted. Her ears moved separately, catching sounds no person heard. Then Psalm joined her, then Notch. For 3 mornings, the old cattle ignored the cactus stacks Clara and Will had worked so hard to cut. They paced the same line along the fence, not frantic but fixed. At night, Clara heard them lowing in the dark, a deep, restless sound that entered the house through the adobe walls. Will was frightened by it. Clara was too, though she did not say so. On the 4th morning, Saint walked to the gate and stood with her horns spread across the sunrise. Clara opened it before she knew she had decided. "Where?" she whispered. Saint did not head toward the well. She did not head toward the arroyo. She walked straight across the property to the ugliest piece of ground Clara owned, the West Pan. It was a shallow basin of white clay and alkali crust where even creosote refused to take root. The place was so barren Clara had never wasted a fence post around it. In summer it shone like old bone. In winter it held frost but no life. Every buyer who had looked at the deed had mentioned that pan as proof the land was bad. Saint walked to the center of it and stopped. The other 13 cattle spread behind her. For a full minute, nothing happened. Then Saint lowered her head and struck the ground with one hoof. Once, twice, again. The clay gave a dry, hard clack. Notch moved beside her and drove his chipped horn into a crack. Psalm began pawing. Ember scraped with both front feet. Within moments, all 14 cattle were working the pan. Not grazing, not wandering, digging. The sound was terrible and beautiful. Hooves against fired clay, horns grinding crust, breath, dust. Will grabbed Clara's sleeve. "Are they sick?" Clara could not answer. The cattle were opening the earth. The surface broke in plates. Beneath it, the clay was darker. Not wet yet, but different. A brown-black seam under the white shell. Saint dug until blood showed above one hoof. Clara ran forward then with a shovel. If the cattle were mad, she would be mad with them. Will followed with the pick. They worked where the animals worked. The clay came up in heavy chunks. Then the smell changed. Not dust, not salt, mud. Clara froze. A dark spot swelled at the bottom of the hole, 1 inch wide. Then 3. Then a thin thread of water slid over Clara's boot. Will whispered, "Ma'am." The hole filled slowly, painfully slowly, but it filled. Water rose through the wound the cattle had opened in the dead pan, brown at first, then clearer beneath the stirred clay. Saint stopped digging and lowered her muzzle. Clara put a hand on the old cow's neck. She could feel the animal's heart, steady as a drum buried under hide. Old animals keep maps in their bodies, Raphael had told her, and the map had led here. By noon, half the town knew. By afternoon, everyone did. Desperation travels faster than good news because people are already listening for it. They came in wagons, on horseback, on foot. They stood around the West Pan in silence, staring at the shallow hole where water gathered faster than Clara and Will could bale mud from it. It was not a spring in the storybook sense. No clear fountain, no singing stream. It was a seep, a patient underground leak, trapped below a clay seal until horn and hoof and memory broke it open. But in that county that month, enough water was a miracle with dirt in it. Mr. Voss came with his wife and daughters. The blacksmith came, the storekeeper. Men who had laughed at the sale yard. Women who had spoken to Clara like she was already lost. They looked at her differently now, and that was almost harder to bear. Then Harlan Pike arrived. He came in a buggy, not on horseback, with 2 hired men behind him and his face arranged into authority. The crowd parted before thinking. Pike stepped to the edge of the pan and looked down at the water. He looked at it the way starving men look at bread and rich men look at land. "Nobody draws from this," he said. The words struck the crowd like a thrown stone. Clara stood knee-deep in mud with a shovel in her hand. Pike took a folded document from his coat. "This seep lies in the west drainage. That drainage runs toward my lower pasture. Under territorial water use, I have a prior claim until a judge determines flow." It sounded official because Pike knew how to make theft wear a clean collar. People looked at one another. No one knew the law well enough to answer him. Pike did. That was part of the weapon. Clara looked at the hole, then at the cattle, then at the faces around her. The old version of her arithmetic would have been simple. Keep the water, guard it, sell it, become safe by letting everyone else remain thirsty. She understood in that instant that scarcity does not only test what a person can endure, it tests what a person is willing to become. Clara planted the shovel in the mud. "Mr. Voss," she called. The farmer startled as if he had been accused. "Bring your team tomorrow at sunup," Clara said. "One day's labor each week keeps your family and stock on the water list." A murmur moved through the crowd. She raised her voice. "Same for anyone able to work. We widen the seep. We stone the sides. We build troughs so animals do not foul it. Those who are sick, widowed, elderly, or have children too small to leave, take water without charge until they can trade something honest." Pike's face reddened. "You cannot allocate contested water." Clara looked at him then. "This water was found by cattle you called worthless on land you called useless. If a judge wants to come dig beside us, he can have a cup." For one heartbeat, no one moved. Then Raphael, who had been standing at the back, laughed softly. Not at Clara, at the shape of things. Mr. Voss stepped forward first. "I'll bring stone." The blacksmith said, "I'll make a screen for the mud." The storekeeper said, "I have 2 barrels." Will stood a little taller. Pike folded his paper with hands that shook. His authority had always required people to believe the world was his to explain. That afternoon, standing beside a muddy hole opened by 14 despised cattle, belief shifted. The next morning, work began before sunrise. They made a basin around the seep and lined it with stone. They dug a narrow channel into a wooden trough. They built a fence around the source so cattle and horses drank below it, not in it. Clara did not shout. She did not become grand. She measured, assigned, corrected, worked. The town, which had spent a year watching her fail, now took orders from her because she knew the seep better than anyone else, and because Saint stood near the source like a judge no one wanted to disappoint. Water came slowly, so they learned to be slow. Families came by schedule. Barrels were marked. Arguments were settled before they became fights. No one got enough to be comfortable. Most got enough to stay alive. That was the hardest mercy. Not abundance. Discipline. Pike tried the law for 3 weeks and found the law less useful when witnesses multiplied. Every man who dug at the seep had seen where the water rose. Every woman who filled a barrel knew whose land held it. The territorial clerk was 2 counties away and had his own drought to survive. So Pike tried shame. He told people Clara was making them labor for water that belonged to God. The women who had carried barrels over 2 miles did not care. He said she was hoarding. The men standing beside her in the mud did not care. He said the old cattle had not found anything, that seep water was luck, that anyone could have opened the pan. Raphael answered that one at the store. Anyone did not, he said. That should have ended it. But thirst makes a proud man reckless. Near midnight, Will woke in Clara's barn to Saint bellowing. Not lowing, bellowing. A hard, furious sound that shook dust from the rafters. Will sat up in the hayloft and saw movement across the moonlit pan. A man was digging beyond the stone wall, not widening the basin, cutting away from it, a trench, a thief's ditch. Will climbed down barefoot and ran, not to Clara, to the Voss place. By the time Pike had opened a channel the length of a wagon tongue, lanterns were coming over the flats. Mr. Voss, the blacksmith, Raphael. 6 more behind them. Clara came last, carrying no weapon, only the same shovel she had used the day water rose. Pike stood in the half-made trench, mud to his ankles, breath tearing out of him. For once he had no official paper, no clean collar for the thing he was doing. Only a shovel. And water creeping toward his boots. No one struck him. No one had to. The lantern light did worse. It showed him clearly. Pike looked from face to face and found no buyer. No voter, no neighbor willing to pretend. He dropped the shovel. The sound was small. Then he walked into the dark. After that, his fields shrank to what his remaining men could manage. His red cattle were sold in lots. His name stayed on the deed, but not on the county's trust. That belonged elsewhere now. Not to Clara alone. To the seep. To the work list. To the old cattle lying in the mesquite shade, chewing as if they had never been called worthless. The drought held until October. No one forgot the taste of rationed water. No one forgot the hour they were allowed to fill. No one forgot which animals had found the source, or which woman had refused to turn survival into a private kingdom. When rain finally came, it arrived without drama. No thunder first, no black wall over the mountains, just a gray morning, a cool breath, and then drops darkening the dust one by one. People stepped into doorways and stood still. Some cried. Most did not. They had spent too much feeling on staying alive. Clara stood beside the west pan as rain stippled T-skip, making rings inside rings on the surface. Saint drank, lifted her pale face, and looked across the flats. Mud clung to her hooves. Silver water ran from her muzzle. She was still thin, still old, still awkward. Still everything the sale barn had laughed at, and she was magnificent. Raphael came to stand beside Clara with his hat in his hands. "You watched," he said. Clara shook her head. "Not soon enough. Soon enough is the only enough there is." Will, taller now, was scratching Ember behind the horn while her new calf tried to stand under her belly. Across the pan, men were already talking about a permanent trough, a better stone wall, a schedule for maintaining the source even after the rains. The seep had not made them rich, it had made them responsible. That winter, Clara's herd grew by 4 calves. By the next year, ranchers who had once laughed began asking quiet questions about old blood, hard feet, and browse lines. A few bought animals like hers and stopped calling them bones. Clara never sold Saint, not for beef, not for breeding. Not when a buyer offered more than a proper cow should ever have brought. The old cow had earned the right to die on land she had helped open. Years later, people would argue over what really happened. Some said the cattle smelled water. Some said they felt cool ground through their hooves. Some said a spring had always been there, and Clara had only been lucky enough to own the clay above it. Maybe all of that was true, but the people who had stood in the pan that day remembered the deeper truth. The county had trusted size, money, new breeds, deep wells, clean papers. Men who spoke loudly. Clara had trusted the creatures that knew scarcity in their bones. She bought 14 ways to fail, and they taught a thirsty town how to live.